Hey guys, it's Tom here, and I will guide you in this tutorial how we're getting from this shot here to this shot. I will explain everything step by step and also show you some techniques I developed over the time for compositing and all the other stuff. Alright, now in most cases I just start with importing all the stuff I need. So let's start with the environment. I'm using this one. Let's rotate by 90 degrees, and I also want the sun on the left side, so I can press S for scale. Then I deactivate the link and I want to flip it, so -100. And now it's flipped, so I can link it back together and scale it up. Let's scale it up to maybe something like this here. To visualize it better, where I want to frame my sun, for example, I can go to this icon here, and I want to enable my proportional grid. So I can see it like this, but I want to have it in a different way. So I have to go to my preference, guides and grids, and I want my proportional grid in another color. So let's maybe use a black one. And let's use horizontal and vertical 3. And let's hit OK. Now it's looking like this, looking a lot better. And I want my sun basically in this edge here, something like this. And now I can also add my other environment. So for this, I got my ground here. Let's add it in as well. I will use a pre-composed for this. I will call this ground as well. And I'm using the first one. So if I would use this one, then comp inside will not be the same size as the ground I have now here, but I want to have a composition that is the same size as the ground. So let's hit OK for this. And if we go inside, you can see it's now this big here. Perfect. One thing I also want to change for the ground is I want to make the top area here a little darker. So let's add an adjustment layer, and I use exposure on this, and let's decrease it. And because I only want this top part here, we can draw a mask like so. And let's feather this mask to a value of 100 or something like this. Maybe not this strong here, maybe more something like this. And yeah, this is looking good. So now we got this top area here a little darken up. But I want to have my ground a little bit flipped. So we're using -100 as well. And now what we want is we want to start at frame 1 and the top in the right here. And I basically want this here, this corner as the height. So maybe something like this. And I can hit P after I again use my scale here and link it again. So let's use the position. And if you enable the stopwatch on the position, you can add a keyframe. Let's move to the last frame, and I will move over here. And again, I want to have this edge here on this height. Perfect. So now if I watch my animation, it's looking like this, looking pretty good. But the background should be moving as well, because this is looking really weird. So let's also use a position for this here. Maybe I will move it first a little bit to the left, and then I'm moving it more to the right. So this is starting to make more sense now. Maybe a little bit more to the left, or even a little bit more to the right. Maybe something like this, something like this. I think this is a little bit too fast now. So more something like this. Yeah, looking good. All right. Now let's also pre-compose the environment here. We will also call it environment. And in this time, we're using the second one here as a composition. So like so. Now the environment is the same size as this here. It's our main composition. And I also want to add some blur on this. So let's add in camera lens blur, maybe of a value of 8 here, something like this. And also maybe some curves for later on to decrease the contrast. We can basically move this here a little bit up, maybe this here a little bit down. And you can see we basically just deleted some of the contrast here. But I want maybe more something like this. Yeah, this is looking good. All right. For the ground here, we also add some effects, because in here we need some more contrast. And to control it, we can add an adjustment layer above and using a tint here. And we need to get the right feeling so it looks more natural in the black and white tone. So before this, we will delete the proportional grid here. And on the ground, I again using curves here. Let's increase the contrast here, more something like this. The foreground should be more contrasty than the background, because the background is really far away. So you can't really visible this much contrast in there. Also because the scene is really bright, the foreground should be more contrasty in this case anyways. All right. Now I also want to add some more of the blue tone for this. So we're switching the channel from RGB to blue. And inside the shadow, we're adding some blue tone, but not in the highlights, like so. And at the end, we also want some tint, or I'm using tree tone for this one. Let's disable the adjustment layer. And I will select some color from the background, maybe this one. Let's increase it to maybe around 40. And this is looking pretty okay. But maybe for the ground, I will change something up. Maybe more, something like this. Yeah, this is looking good for now. Alright, now I also want to have some more blue tone in the environment in the background. So let's add a solid layer for this. And maybe I use a color like this here. Looking good. Now we will draw a mask. So using the rectangle tool here, draw a mask like this, and let's feather it here. Not this hard. And then we set the blend mode to screen. So we got something like this. And now we can start adding our character here. If you also want to learn a technique how to delete the highlights from the character to create own highlights for the character in 3D, you can also watch another tutorial of mine. I will also link it in the description. So now let's add the character above the ground together with the opacity map. And I also will freeze every second frame for the opacity map and the character. For this I also have a script, but you can also do it manually. So just go to here, enable time remapping, set a keyframe every second frame, like so. And at the end, just use toggle hold frame. But as I said, I have a script for this. This is also in the tutorial that is linked in my description. So now let's freeze every second frame. And let's also plug in the light map and do the same for this as well. Looking good. Now let's comp Taki and the opacity map together. And this is my character. And I want to duplicate it and call it highlights, like so. Now for the highlights, I want to mat it to my light map here, but not as an alpha, but as a luma mat. So we're only using the black and white values here to change the highlights here. So if, for example, I use an exposure now and increase it, you can see the highlights are appearing. But before, I will also want to add some effects on here. I also have it in my tool, so add highlights. And I got my extractor here at first. I will go step by step. So at first I'm using my extractor map, then I'm using my tint, adding an exposure for later control to increase and decrease the highlights. Then I want to sharpen up the edges. If I increase my exposure now, you can see it automatically here. And another one for more control. Now let's increase it here to something like this. Let's also soften the edges a little bit more. I think here I have to increase it a little bit more. And now let's deactivate it. The exposure here is a little bit too high, so let's lower it. And I think I will do it in general in another method. So on the character, I will just use a really low value here because I want much contrast here. So maybe a value of minus 4.3 or something like this. And for the highlights, I also don't need this much, but more something like this. Now let's watch it. Looking good. To control it even further, we can add a null layer over here. And let's select the highlights and the character and drag and drop it to the null layer. Now we can move the null layer around, but we also need our light map on this. So let's also do that real quick, like so. Now if we move it around, you can see it's perfectly matched to the null layer. But my opacity map is not working yet because I also need to set Taki to the opacity map with a luma mat, like so. Now if we hit this button, you can see it's now transparent. And if we go to here, we can see our background again. Now I can move him around. And let's enable the grid again. And I want to have the head basically over here. Can also scale him a little bit around, but not as much, so it doesn't look weird. Maybe I want him a little bit bigger, something like this. Let's watch the result. Looking good. But for my character, I also need some other changes on the shadows, because my shadow should be cooler. And for this, I'm again using a curves on the blue channel. And let's just bump it up. And also a hue and saturation at the end. And let's decrease the saturation slightly. For the highlights, let's add a tree tone here and select color near the sun, something like this. I also want to have it above the exposure. We can even decrease the exposure a little bit more. And also in hue and saturation at the end. So more something like this. All right, now let's disable the proportional grid again. And now we got this looking cool. I also want to fit some colors over here, and I'm not a fan of this mouth thing here, so I maybe increase it even further so it's more softened up. And yeah, it's looking good. All right, let's duplicate the character layer here and move it above the light map. And I will delete everything on here. And let's re-add an exposure. I will decrease it a little bit and also add the tree tone again. To get a better pick for my color, I'm going to my environment and I increase the blur radius. Now I can go to my character and I maybe want to pick this color here. Looking cool. Now I can move it back to 8. And on my character, I will maybe increase the blend with original. And on my character, I will press T for the opacity and also change my blend mode to lighten. Now let's decrease it here a little bit more. Just want it really slight. And I think something like this is pretty cool. All right, now we got the character with the lighting. And we can start with adding some other stuff. I also prepared some birds here. So let's add the birds inside here. I will add it above the cyan layer. Let's scale them really small. Maybe a value of 10 is pretty good. Let's move it over here. And let's hit the position key over here on the first frame. Move over here. And yeah, this is looking pretty cool. The only thing I need to change is, again, I need a camera lens blur on this. So let's add one and maybe also a value of 8. And we need to add a tint on this as well. So let's add a tint. And the black should be maybe the black of the mountains here. Something like this. Looking way better. All right. Maybe I should even increase the blur more. We can also try another blur, maybe the fast blocks blur. So let's add this one. And yeah, I think this is better in this case. Maybe use a value of 14. And yeah, that's looking good. All right. We can move on. And we can start with some color grading techniques here. Because my sun is here, I want here more some darken space. And for this, I can again use a solid layer. I'm using a dark bluish color, like so. And let's draw a really simple mask here, something like this. And feather this up. And you can play around here with some settings. And even increase the exposure to maybe a value of 30. But I think I use normal, something like this. It's looking pretty cool. All right, now for the sun, I also use a solid layer because I want to use optical flares here. It's also an external plugin. Let's go to options here. And I think the blindness one here is pretty cool. Let's add it. And I want to go to my screen mode and I want to set it to add. Let's move it to the sun here. And I want to turn off the optical flare for now. And let's go to the sun here with the position X epsilon on frame 1. And let's move it over here. And we also need some center position changes. So it starts maybe over here. We can enable it again. So we want to make it start over here at frame 1 and slightly move it to the left. Looking cool. Now let's select the last 2 frames here because I want to change the position a little bit more. Go to the first frame and let's just move it to over here. And I also want to only change this here maybe to something like this. Oh, it's way too fast. Maybe something like this. And yeah, I think this is looking pretty cool. Now we can decrease the brightness here to a value of 30 maybe. And the scale to a value of 90. We start to getting somewhere. It's looking cool. I also need some stuff in the foreground because I got the feeling that the foreground is pretty empty. So for this, it's pretty simple. I will just draw a shape here with the fill layer enabled and mouse stroke. And I will make it black like so. Let's draw a shape. Maybe something like this here looks pretty good. And let's add it under the adjustment layer. And I will make a new composition and call it lamp, for example. Let's use a directional blur on this. Let's increase it to something like this. And we want to change the positioning. So we start over here maybe and go out of the frame and move a little bit forward and moving completely to the right side. So let's visualize it. Yeah, looking good, but it's maybe a little bit too dark. So we can add a tint afterwards. And let's select maybe this color over here and make it slightly darker. Something like this. And it is looking way better. We can now duplicate the layer. We can also crop the layer a little bit. And we maybe want to move it over here. So now we got some lamps. And one thing that could be also really cool, we could end like this here. Or we can even start with 1. So maybe we want to start like this here. This is our starting frame. And then we have 1 over here. All right. Maybe we need to also change 1 up. So we're getting this here over here. So it doesn't look so cut here. All right. Looking cool. Now the next thing we can even make a composition out of this and call it lamps, like so. Let's make the composition as long as this here. And we maybe even want to make some changes in here. So let's delete all the effects from these layers and we select this one and just put it on the top one here, like so. All right. It's a little optimization thing, so it's a little bit faster inside After Effects now. One thing we can also add are something for the camera. So let's add it above the lamps. And this is this beautiful grunge map here. Let's also add some masks over here. And I also want to feather them. So something like this here. And also something like this. And I want to decrease it here and set it to screen maybe. Want to even decrease it more. Really slightly here. I think it's way too much. Maybe 20 is good. And yeah, it is looking better. All right. Now let's add another adjustment layer, and we will start with the color grading. And for this, I'm using Magic Bullet Looks. So let's dive in, and we're getting this window, but I don't need the presets here. And we will start with a gradient maybe from the bottom to the top, maybe something like this here. I want to make it really bluish, something like this. Decrease it here a little bit more. Yeah, something like this, looking good. Now, the next thing I want to add is something for the lens, so using some optical diffusion. And I also want to increase the density maybe slightly, so it's more wrapping around the character here a little bit. Maybe also the size here. And I think something like this looks good. All right, the next thing I want to add is some edge softness. Let's add this as well. So maybe something like so. So the camera and the character is in place. I think this is looking good. And maybe increase the blur size. I think a value of this is pretty fine. The next things I want to have is some lens distortion, but I don't want it like this, but more like in fisheye, something like this really slightly. Let's increase it only on the edges again to give it a more interesting look. All right, we also want some haze flares, so it's also giving a really nice touch here. I maybe want to decrease this here. The softness is pretty okay. Now let's add also some chromatic aberrations, and I will increase this cyan a little bit, the magenta, and also decrease the yellow here. So now we're getting here the edges a little bit more interesting in a more magenta look. And let's also add the color star. And inside here, I maybe want to warm up the scene a little bit, really slightly, and also give it a slightly more pinker tone here. So this is looking interesting. Let's also decrease the exposure a little bit, but bump up the contrast. Maybe not this much, but something like this. Also for the sun, maybe I want to add a little bit more saturation in the brighter parts here. I think something like this looks good. All right. We also want to add some noise again. So let's add the renoiser at the end. But this is way too much, so we will decrease it to maybe a value of 39. Looks good. If you have some nice LUTs, you can also use them, but I don't really want to use them now. But what I really want to use is some spot fill here for the sun, so this area. And I want to make it more in an orange tone here. And let's increase the fill. So you can see here the fill is increasing. So now let's make it warmer, something like this. I think this is looking good. And maybe also a swinging tiles here before the spotlight. So I want to have my sun and character in focus, something like this here. Let's increase the blur size slightly and decrease the strength here to a value of 28. All right, now we got the color grading here, but I think maybe the bottom here is a little bit too blurred. So let's also change it again. Maybe something like this. For the edge softness, I want to move it a little bit. I will make it a little bit bigger. I think this is a little bit better now. I also want some black bars. So again, using a solid layer here. And I'm using the CC draws effect on this. We don't need some height in here, but the value of 85, looking good. Now this is the comp now, and I think it looks really cool how he's running and also with the lamps in front. I hope you could learn a lot of things in here. And if you have any more questions, feel free to ask me on Discord. And also make sure to check out my other tutorials. And yeah, with all that said, thank you for watching guys, stay creative and see ya.